Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. The 94th episode, 16th of September. Had to check the date, I'm afraid. Lot of stories for you where Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch, your favorite movement-driven news source, general news source. Why even movement-driven? One of the best places to get the news. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Happy to be with you on this Friday. We're going to go with a very positive story, it seems. We're going to look at the Brazilian elections. I'm surprising myself by saying a story about elections is positive, especially in 2022. Zoe, what's going on in that titanic election in Brazil between Lula and Bolsonaro?
Well, I'm still remaining a bit reserved in terms of whether I say it's good news or bad news. Polls have pretty much stayed the same. One of the biggest polling agencies, Datafolha, which has one of the most respected kind of formulas and methodologies for doing voter opinion polls, just released another poll yesterday. Lula is polling at 45% compared to Bolsonaro's 33%. This has essentially been the difference that's been present for the past couple of weeks. It hasn't changed a ton. There's been tiny differences in other polls, but this is pretty much the standard at this point. As you said, we're 2 weeks away. We're 2 weeks away from these titanic elections. The big question on everyone's mind is not really, is Lula going to win? Because it seems like it's pretty much in the bag. Bolsonaro has essentially a 33% stronghold of Bolsonaro supporters, people who have been completely loyal to him. But this hasn't really increased, and people don't expect that it will increase, even if it goes for a second round. Most likely, people who vote for other candidates will either vote in a null vote or support Lula. So the question is, who knows what happens? October could be crazy, and all of this could be completely turned on its head. But really, at this point, the question is Lula going to win in the first round? The tendency is indicating that it's possible. He's at 45%. As I said, Bolsonaro isn't going to really increase beyond 33, 35%. But it also depends what's going to happen with these other candidates. Ciro Gomes, who is essentially serves to be a diversion away from the Workers' Party, has not dropped out of the race despite polling below 10%. He continues to have pretty low numbers, not a popular figure in Brazilian politics. And so really the question is Lula going to be able to push over the threshold of 50% to get this first round election? We'll see. If he does win in the first round, it will definitely put him in a stronger position to take on these challenges that Brazil faces today. It's in a deep economic crisis, deep social crisis, deep political, deep social crisis. As we've reported at People's Dispatch, unemployment rate through the roof. The real has lost a lot of its value, increase in numbers of homelessness in Brazil. Hunger, Brazil's back on the hunger map with millions of people suffering from food insecurity. Lula is going to need not only a strong Congress, but also really to show that he has the confidence of the people to be able to enact the bold policies that will be necessary to lift Brazil out of this crisis, to fight the privatization that happened during the Temer presidency, during the Bolsonaro presidency. A lot of the major achievements that Brazil was able to make during Lula's presidency, during Dilma's presidency, were completely reversed during these years of Temer and Bolsonaro. This will be key. He needs to show that he has a strong foot forward. However, first round victory also means it opens the door for Bolsonaro to, kind of wage a full-fledged campaign about voter fraud. If it's a close race in the first round, there are a lot of concerns about what the response of Bolsonaro would be. That being said, this week in a podcast interview, he said that he would hand over power if he loses in the elections. This is, of course, contrary to what he's been saying for months, contrary to what he was said on the 7th of September to his supporters. So really, as we've said, anything can happen in October, but this is what we've seen so far. This is what the polls are saying, and this is what analysts are saying generally.
This is what analysts are saying. Amazing how generous of him to say that if he loses an election, he'll hand over power. Remarkable. Wish the Egyptian president could hear this statement from Mr. Bolsonaro. In Egypt, of course, a whole other different crisis, Prashant. Very, very sad news coming from the prisons of Egypt. Tell us what's happening there.
All right, Vijay, like you said, of course, with Abdul Fattah el-Sisi, the issue is not about handing power if he loses, as much as or rigging elections so that he never loses, which seems to be the case. But Egypt is a remarkable situation right now. It's going to host COP27 very soon, a meeting where leaders across the world are going to come together, talk about how to somehow save this world from disaster, how to build some kind of an equitable way to sort of redistribute our resources. But Egypt is also a country where it seems that of nearly 120,000 prisoners, over 65,000 are at least political prisoners. And that's an unbelievable number. And the most recent statistic has been that close to three political prisoners have died in almost about a week or so. And, most of these people have gone to jail after Abdul Fattah el-Sisi came to power in his military coup in 2013. And we have seen this issue being highlighted again and again. We've seen the fact that, rights organizations, for instance, have continuously raised this, especially also keeping COP27 in the forefront. But what does not seem to have changed is the fact that across the world, Abdul Fattah el-Sisi continues to enjoy the kind of a complete untrammeled support, so to speak. We saw that he did meet the Biden and other leaders in the region recently, and this is despite the fact that there has been a fair amount of chronicling of this kind of the horrible situation inside Egyptian jails. A key aspect, of course, being the fact that medical negligence is attributed is the key aspect. By medical negligence, what people really mean is that prisoners are treated so badly, their health conditions are ignored and completely left unmonitored, so that they sort of move towards an extremely bad situation health-wise. And we also have the instance of Ala Abdul Fattah, who probably one of the most prominent political prisoners in Egypt. Again, despite the huge international outcry, we see that in recent times he has been on a hunger strike for months now, consuming almost no solid food, if I'm not mistaken. Despite all this, he's barely been allowed to meet his family. The kind of it's not facilities, but a kind of even basic rights that are even a prisoner enjoys in most parts of the world are completely denied to him. And this is after a career of political persecution. The fact that he's been put in jail multiple times for charges such as spreading fake news. Many of the charges against political prisoners are like these, so vague: spreading fake news, a random notion of terrorism. A huge number of people are in pretrial detention as well, which has been used by the state very effectively to sort of ensure that any kind of dissent is foiled. So I think, as we move towards COP27, this is a very important question that people's movements also need to keep asking and highlighting, because Egypt is the linchpin of the imperialist project in West Asia, because, from the it gets a huge amount of supplies from the United States. It is essential in blockading Gaza. It plays the role of a collaborator with Israel. So all these together, even in Sudan, for instance, it has its own interventions, in the Horn of Africa as well, Libya for that matter. So keeping all these interventions in mind, I think Egypt is really a country that people's movements, rights organizations really need to keep focusing on, especially as we move towards an event which will have international attention.
You pointed out the very grave problem of the prisons in Egypt. Of course, there are consistently human rights reports written about this. The United Nations has weighed in on this. Doesn't seem to have much of an impact. But look, I'm going to take us to Syria, where there is a new UN report, 50-page report, very interesting report about the renewal of fighting inside Syria in both the northwest and northeast, different sectors of the fighting in the northwest, largely around the area of Idlib, where the various, let's say, the anti-government forces have been holed up. Very ugly fighting starting there in the northwest, where of course there's the remaining oil of the Syrian people. There is a battle with various forces, including, if I'm not to be too critical of the UN report, also gangsters. There's very little of that in the report. The UN officials have warned that large scale fighting might start again. They hope it will not. Currently, they estimate that the government of Bashar al Assad controls about 70% of Syria. It's pretty amazing. 30% is outside the control of the government, of the territory. There's been some increase of aerial bombardment, including by Russian aircraft. This is of interest, of note, because of course, the war in Ukraine that continues, where I must say, and I'll come back to this in the end, the Ukrainian forces made enormous gains in Kharkiv and in other parts of Ukraine, pushing Russian forces back almost to the Donbass region, and in some places to the Russian territory itself. But in Syria, there's some increase of Russian bombing and so on. But the bit that caught my eye, which was to me really underreported, was the dozen or more Israeli airstrikes against Syria in the past 6 months, in the first 6 months of 2022. In these first 6 months, there have been a dozen airstrikes. What has Israel been striking? Here's what's interesting. Israel has been hitting not military targets, but has been hitting the airport in Damascus and the airport in Aleppo. These are principally night raids. There was a night raid on Aleppo airport on the 31st of August. And then the Israeli planes came back and bombed the airport on the 6th of September. These bombings have been, and my notes are pretty specific, they've been bombing various kinds of navigational capacities, radars at the airports and things like that. The authorities at Aleppo International Airport worry that if a bomb strikes, say, a place where there are civilians, the chance of civilian casualties very high. The intensity of the attacks has increased. The Syrians sent a note to the United Nations. It says Syria reminds the UN that Israel today has no qualms about expanding its repeated attacks on different areas of Syrian territory and endangering Syrian airports and civil aircraft. Now, this has happened at the same time as the Europeans have lifted sanctions on the Syrian airline Charm Wings, the main government airline that flies inside and around Syria. The Europeans have lifted sanctions on the airline, and just at that point, the Israelis are bombing Syrian airports. It's interesting that there's been very little consideration about this. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because not because the Syrians have been complaining about it, and I read out part of their statement, not because of that, but because in a United Nations report, it is noted specifically that the Israelis have bombed at least a dozen sites. It's a very conservative number inside Syria because there's a lot of contested bombings by Israel that have taken place. I'm not even focusing on that. I'm just focusing on the simple fact that Israel has been bombing two civilian airports, not the military side of the airport, but civilian infrastructure in the airport, for which reason the airports have to constantly shut down or fly blind without radar. Very dangerous, endangering civilians inside Syria. Very little international commentary on this, and I'm not surprised by that, but I want to raise it for our viewers and listeners to pay attention to. This has not been happening. Now, I said I was going to come back to the issue of Ukraine because to some extent it is related. As I said, the Russians have been stepping up bombing inside Syria at the same time as the Russian forces suffered a real defeat in Kharkiv, being pushed back. There's a lot of conversation on Russian television shows, open debate about the war, about how the logistical lines had been stretched, and whether Russia should go for a full mobilization and therefore increase the war in intensity. Not clear exactly what decisions will be made. At the end of the program, I'm going to come back to a meeting being held in Samarkand of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is at that meeting. Come back to this part of the story. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. 94th show that we have. Today is an important day in Mexico. It's the 16th of September. In the Zocalo, tens of thousands of people are gathering, not only in the Zocalo, but in other squares, public squares in Mexico, celebrating their great day of independence. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador going to speak and so on. He's the president of Mexico. Zoe, you have something else on your mind, I think, something about the Assanges. I gather that they have decided to pay a visit to Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador.
Well, it is important to mention that this great day in Mexico, because a lot of the presidency of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has invited many personalities, politicians, social leaders to participate in this anniversary of independence. And because of the story that I'm going to talk about, which has to do with the Assanges, it's interesting to think of this celebration and this gathering happening in Mexico and parallel to what's happening in the UK, where people are also gathering, but it's to commemorate and enshrine colonialism and the royal family. And really just kind of want to point out a bit of the moral bankruptcy that we see kind of existing in the UK and Europe. And really what we're seeing from Latin America is an emerging kind of unabashed challenge to US imperialism. For the past several months, leaders across Europe have essentially bowed to US interests on all fronts, whether it's energy sanctions on Russia, whether it's upholding their different policies. Whereas we've seen in the past week, the government of the city of Mexico bestowed the keys of the city to Julian Assange, the co-founder of WikiLeaks, who is being persecuted by the US government in collusion with the government of the UK and other European governments. A Spanish spy agency was spying on him when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. In Sweden, the case in Sweden was really the basis for which he was detained. And we've seen in the past week, not only in Mexico has he been invited to have asylum in Mexico by AMLO. His family was given the keys to the city. They were welcomed into the Congress chambers, but also former Honduran President Manuel Zelaya also called on the UK to release Julian Assange. So it's really interesting to see this moral voice of reason emerge from this region that has been so long attacked by the United States, been under the boot of US imperialism, and they're standing up on very key issues, not only issues that relate to their own economies, but really issues of international order, of geopolitical independence from US imperialism. So I think it's an incredibly interesting moment right now in Latin America with the reconfiguration of the political scene with more progressive governments. And a big question was always going to be, how are they going to take on US imperialism? What is going to be the response? And what we've seen in Mexico, what we've seen with these statements from Manuel Zelaya is that they're going to stand up to US imperialism and on these questions that are so sensitive to the State Department, which is, of course, Julian Assange. And, as we've been reporting at People's Dispatch, Assange this year is a crucial year for his case. His extradition order was approved by the former Home Secretary. Of course, now with the change in Prime Minister with Liz Truss, there is a shift in the cabinet. And this case continues, but the UK has not changed its stance on whether to not only keep Julian Assange in prison, but also on his extradition. But people of the world are still standing up. On October 8th and 9th, they're going to be surrounding the UK Parliament in a human chain to demand that lawmakers take action and demand his release. There's several other campaigns going on to call for his release. Julian Assange is considered by many a prisoner of the empire because he dared to reveal these crimes of imperialism, which of course we are always referring to on this show, the crimes that we saw in Iraq and of course in Afghanistan, which I know Prasanth is going to talk a little bit about now.
Yes, Prashant is going to talk about it because there's a great article on the People's Dispatch website by Amitabh Roy Chowdhury. I really found it interesting, Prashant. I'm glad that you've run it. He's a veteran journalist. What's the story with this humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan?
Right, of course, Vijay, it's a twofold crisis. We talked about the crimes of imperialism. On the one hand, it's a crisis, we'll come to that, but the most recent bit of news was the fact that the United States has decided to, you know, for the purposes of safekeeping, mind you, that's a very important word to note. It has decided to transfer Afghanistan's money of foreign reserves basically to a to a trust in Switzerland, in a Swiss bank, basically. And this is one of the most absurd bits of news. You get to hear, or you get to hear a lot of absurd news as part of journalism. But this, even by those standards, kind of stood out for a chutzpah, because we know that Afghanistan's reserves were frozen by the United States along with its allies. There was nearly $7 billion that the US had control over. First of all, with nobody's consent, the Biden administration decided to split it into two, and reserve one bit for legal proceedings related to the 9/11 attack, in which the Taliban basically had no role to play. But nonetheless, $3.5 billion of Afghanistan's money, of the Afghan people's money, was basically allocated for that. And then, for regarding the other 3.5 billion, there have been talks going on for months regarding what to do about it. And again, mind you, the important thing is that this is the Afghan people's money. And finally, sorry, the decision that has been taken is to transfer this to another entity, which will then have, which will then be magnanimous enough to approve transactions for various economic aspects, may not necessarily be for aid per se. So this is basically what has happened over the past 2 days. I was reading a Washington Post report of this, which had a very interesting line, which said that the US and the Taliban have wrestled over the money for months. Now, I found this very interesting because it gives the impression that this is something two parties have a right on, whereas that's really not the case. And it's tragic that this is happening at this point of time, because Afghanistan is going into its second winter under the Taliban, and it looks like we talked about this last winter as well. It's depressing coming back to some of these subjects so regularly. We talked about this last winter, about how bad the situation was, and this winter, nearly a year later, nothing really seems to have changed, because apparently for about 92% of households are struggling to meet their food needs, as the article points out. If you look, for instance, at the fact that the economic output of the country has shrunk by nearly 30% since last year, August 2021, and despite all the concern expressed by various international players, by various countries who talk about human rights, who talk about, say, making sure we need to help the people, etc., etc., only 40% of the money called by the UN, that's 4.4 billion, has actually been received so far. So this is the kind of situation in which people are. There is widespread poverty. There's widespread hunger. We see Afghanistan has, since 2000, since the US invaded, they really didn't focus on building anything much. But we're seeing an actual deterioration in conditions that is taking place, because of the fact that, on the one hand, the government has, completely failed in so many ways. But more importantly, from an international perspective, countries in the West especially have sort of taken this extremely hardline position, and taken this position by which they basically denied the people of Afghanistan their resources. So keeping all this in mind, very, very difficult time in the coming months as well for the people. I think it's very important that journalists keep writing about it, but not just write about it in terms of a humanitarian disaster, which it is, but also link this humanitarian disaster to the policies of those who would deny the people of Afghanistan the money and whatever little help it can bring. No one is saying that that money would solve all the problems, or that money is the only reason for these problems. But it is, I think, very irresponsible not to link these two.
Well, it's something to pay attention to. 20 years ago, the countries that surrounded Afghanistan, including China, which took leadership on this, assembled a meeting in Shanghai, and in the summer of 2001, they started establishing a dialogue about what to do with the Taliban rule, and how to basically prevent Afghanistan from having a serious meltdown, to put it very bluntly. That grouping developed into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which is meeting yesterday and today in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, for their 22nd meeting. It's a very important meeting. It's a head of government meeting. I want to make some points about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's meeting. The first point is that, well, this is about now 20 years of the SCO. And over these 20 years, from just being a handful of countries that were around Afghanistan, including the Central Asian republics, China, Russia came into the mix very soon, and so on. Now it has grown. India is a member, Pakistan is a member, and in this meeting, Iran joined as a full-scale member of the SCO. So in these 20 years, the SCO really has grown to become a major force in Eurasia, drawing in more and more members in the region. That's the first thing to think about when you think of the SCO. Secondly, the entry of Iran is interesting, and I think it bears some reflection. Now, Iran is taking an interesting position regarding the energy crisis in Europe. As a consequence of the European and US sanctions on Russia, it is getting harder and harder for European countries to source natural gas and oil from Russia. On the 24th of August, the oil minister in Iran, Javad Oji, made a statement in Tehran which actually surprised me. Mr. Oji said that Iran is prepared to supply oil and gas to Europe to make up for whatever deficit there would be from Russia. This is an interesting statement made by Mr. Oji. Essentially, what he's telling the Europeans is, if you can get the United States to come back to the table of the 2050 agreement, well, maybe we can sort something out. But certainly the Iranians, not with the full appetite to start a new negotiation around their nuclear energy policy. They want the United States to return to the 2050 agreement as if Trump hadn't pulled the US unilaterally out of that international agreement. But Mr. Oji said, look, we're quite prepared to supply Europe. Interestingly, during the discussions at the SCO meeting in Samarkand, it has become quite clear that China is willing to buy Iranian and Russian energy up to whatever point is available. In fact, China used to purchase a lot of its energy from Saudi Arabia. That has been declining as China has increasingly been purchasing energy from Russia and Iran. In other words, the SCO is not merely about political issues, and it's not merely about the status of Afghanistan. Subsequent to the US occupation of Afghanistan from 2001 till 2021, that 20-year period, China has developed a different kind of orientation in the region, including the Belt and Road Initiative, also announced in 2013 in Central Asia, building infrastructure and so on. So what you see in the SCO now is trade issues have come to the surface, including energy, infrastructure development. Mr. Xi Jinping in Samarkand promised more funds towards building infrastructure in Central Asia. A huge statement, because Central Asian governments have really been struggling. They are fundamentally integrated to the Russian economy. Sanctions on Russia has had an enormous knock-on effect on Central Asia. I've done two stories about the problems of food security in Central Asia as a consequence of the sanctions on Russia. So the entry of Iran as a full-fledged member in the SCO is a message by the Chinese saying they are actually not prepared to take seriously US sanctions on either Iran or Russia, that they are happy to buy oil and natural gas from both. The third point of importance here is at the Samarkand meeting is the first in-person meeting between Vladimir Putin of Russia and Xi Jinping of China since February 4th. That's before Russia entered Ukraine. And at this meeting, in a public statement made by Mr. Putin, he said something curious. He said that, basically the Chinese don't agree with what we've been doing in Ukraine. He didn't say it so bluntly, but effectively that's what he said. And China has also indicated that, they are not really happy with what's happening in Ukraine. It's a very interesting development. We'll follow it, return to it next week. Final point I want to make about the SCO meeting is, at the SCO meeting, Xi Jinping said all our countries need to worry about color revolutions. I know Zoe, Prashant, and I have had a serious discussion on how to report on some of these issues of color revolutions. Come back to that as well. Friends, you've been listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. Next week, I'm going to be writing an article about the SCO, so hopefully you'll have a more coherent assessment of it. See you next time. It's our 95th show. Only 5 more to go. More selfies needed, guys.